Good afternoon and welcome to today's Writer's Block program with Edward St. Aubyn. I'm Andrea Grossman, the founder of Writer's Block, now nearing the end of our 25th season. Enormous thanks to Teddy for joining us today from London. I'll be moderating the discussion and we welcome your questions. So email them to us at reservations@writersblockpresents.com. It's been a few years since we've had the pleasure of seeing a new St. Aubyn novel. His new book, Double Blind, revolves around three 30-something friends who experience a monumental change in each of their lives. The people in their orbit are equally transfixing. He walks us through the technology of brain mapping, used here as a medical need for one character and as a hot recreational commodity for another. Like the Patrick Melrose books, this new book has crazy rich people, drugs, and some awful parents in the background. But there, the similarities fall aside. There's a new tone and a new subject matter. Teddy introduces rewilding to us, for example, wherein our naturalist hero relieves a large estate of its reliance on pesticides, fertilizers, and commercial agriculture, and instead repopulates it with animals, plants, and insects that it would have seen centuries ago. We meet a young schizophrenic who's nurtured by a compassionate psychoanalyst, opening the door to him and to us for hope and healing. You'll have questions. There's so much more that we will uncover today in this discussion. Again, email those questions to us at reservations@writersblockpresents.com, and we will take as many as we can. I urge you to go to our website to get the link to Skylight Books to order Double Blind. So, Teddy, welcome from London.
Thank you.
I'd like you to talk about the genesis of this book. It explores neuroscience, environmentalism, and technologies on the verge of commercial deployment. But it's still about love. It's still about the nature of love and connection. How did this start? What was the beginning of this for you?
Well, I think that this book has very deep roots in my work that go back beyond the Melroses to some books that I wrote in the 90s, A Clue to the Exit and On the Edge. And that I was troubled then, probably by going to a conference at Tucson called Towards a Science of Consciousness, by the failure of science to include consciousness in its majestic description of the world. And so that was the seed of the problem. And A Clue to the Exit is a book very much about that, with a third-person narrative embedded within a first-person narrative as a kind of illustration of the impossibility of reducing experience to experiment. And so since then, I went on being troubled about whether science had other explanatory gaps that made its description of the world in some way limited. So it's been something that's been worrying me for a long time. And I think also in On the Edge, there were elements that are in this book, which then went underground for a long time while I wrote about the Melrose world. On the Edge is set in Big Sur. It's about the spiritual seeking scene at Esalen and so forth.
And you clearly have a lot of fun poking fun at the spiritual seeking scene in California and Big Sur and in San Francisco. Was it, I can't remember if it was A Clue to the Exit or On the Edge.
It's On the Edge. That one's On the Edge, yes.
Yeah, I mean, where you just have at it with the spiritual seekers and, you know, the bumper sticker guru and stuff. Have you where did that come from? Just from visiting California, from that trip to Arizona? Where did that happen?
The trip to Arizona came after that, when I'd visited Esalen and lived in Big Sur for a few years, or on and off. And lots of claims were being made about the nature of consciousness, and cosmic consciousness, no less. And so and although on the edges satirical to some extent, it's also affectionate, and has, epiphanies in it, as well as absurdities. And then I started to wonder, well, what's the story? What's the scientific story and the philosophical story about consciousness? And that's when I went to the conference in Tucson and started doing the research that turned into A Clue to the Exit. But as you say, the tone of those books, written in the 90s, although they share some of the concerns that Double Blind has, was very different from the tone of Double Blind. And so I think that change of tone is almost more striking than the shift in subject matter as it appears to people who've only read the Melroses. But people who've read those rather less known books of the mid-90s would see continuities. But I think the real change is a change of tone, to something much more. There's a kind of directness and sincerity to Double Blind, which isn't available everywhere in my work.
Right. And there's such a gentleness too. I mean, you handle the characters, with all of them, with such affection, even this horrible, venture capitalist. He's just fueled on meth and stuff like that. I mean, and he's just sort of shockingly greedy, and yet he evolves into he becomes likable. He becomes redeemable.
Yes. I think the whole book is saturated in a kind of faith in regeneration, which is there both in the rewilding project that you've already mentioned, a chance to let the land have a rest from human exploitation and to be itself. And one of the central characters is an ecologist who works on that project. But then the regeneration even extends, as you say, to the venture capitalist who starts out being quite dislikable, but is gradually transformed as well by compassion and by falling in love and by renouncing his passion for altering his mood, and become someone who we care about. I think all the characters end up being cared about. There are only probably two minor characters who would have made the Melrose cut, and who are, there's one fundamentalist geneticist called William Moorhead, and there's a fundamentalist Catholic called Cardinal Lagerfeld, who are united by being greedy and irascible and dogmatic. But they're minor characters. They're the only ones who remain untouched by this general atmosphere in which people are being transformed.
I want to jump to a question that you've probably been asked 1,000 times on this book, but we're going to go to, first of all, explain the title, Double Blind, if you would, and then we're going to jump into some naming issues that I see in the book.
Double blind. Well, I called it double blind because it's the most famous, I suppose, scientific method for certain kinds of science, to have a control group who are not taking the alleged beneficial medicine next to a group that is taking it, and neither the participants nor the people giving the placebo or the medicine know which is which. So that's a double blind test, which is supposed to be the gold standard for establishing the efficacy of a medicine. But there are obviously other implications to the phrase double blind, which is that it might increase both doubleness and blindness. And the book is to some extent about duality and about alienation and about being apart from nature instead of being a part of nature, and all of the mentalities and attitudes and behaviors that lead to that fragmentation, and whether it can be healed. Everyone in the book needs to be healed. There's a character who has a very grave diagnosis, and there's the schizophrenic, and the land needs to be healed. Everyone is, and it's full of sort of people who want to heal other people, and this is rather than harm them, which is the main characteristic of many characters in the Melrose books. These are the healers rather than the harmers that I'm characterizing now.
Did what made you want to move away from the harmers? Because
they were all mined out, you know. There's that the Melrose mine was exhausted, although who knows, but it no longer served my purposes, you know, and I suppose at the same time I always feel that writing a novel isn't worthwhile unless it's a high-risk enterprise, and so the high risk in the Melroses is obvious, you know, because writing about paedophilia or addiction is a high-risk enterprise. But in this case, the high risk was taking things which I'd kept in my private life as a source of great importance to me, but never written about, because I didn't want to discuss them in public. I wanted to protect them, you know, the things like psychoanalysis and meditation, and the fact that I know some people who have a rewilding project, and I'm very passionate about it. And so the risk I'm taking in this novel is the risk of sincerity, if you like, of not having a kind of palisade of irony to protect what I'm saying. At the end of At Last, Patrick Melrose wonders whether he can ever give up irony, which he calls the hardest addiction of all, the desire to be in two places at once, or to mean two things at once. So you can't be pinned down.
And yet the title of your book is Double Blind, and it's about duality, right?
But it's about healing duality rather than the causes of duality.
Okay. Right.
So I suppose the risk I took was to take those things which matter to me and in some sense make them more public by putting them in a novel. And that felt very audacious to me. I don't know why it should strike anyone else that way, but it did to me, writing like that, because I thought there isn't any structural irony. Of course, I didn't wake up one morning being an entirely different person who didn't notice the absurd things in life or care about prose style or want to make a joke, but I didn't want the whole book to be protected by irony.
I want to walk over to naming issues that have been brought up and that are pretty obvious to some, but of course there's the neurosurgeon Mr. McEwen, who's one of my favorite novelists, although he's not a neurosurgeon yet, as far as I know. And also Haworth, the name of the estate that is being rewilded, it's so similarly named to the Bronte, the origin of the Bronte girls, right? It's Haworth, and
Right.
and I'm wondering, are there any, was that an homage to I'm sure it was to Ian McEwan, or a hats off to him, but can you explain that a little bit?
Yes, there's an homage to Ian, certainly, there, who has a brain surgeon in one of his novels. And I hadn't made the Bronte connection, so this is a classic example of the reader knowing more than the writer knows about his own work or her own work, which sometimes happens. No, I didn't know that, and I wasn't thinking about that.
Okay.
I don't even know if I thought about it as being how worthwhile it is. I just thought of an English sounding name, but I suppose if I meant anything more by it, it was, how worthwhile it was to do this wilding.
Well, I'm so thrilled that I brought that to your attention.
Well, I now feel deeply connected to the Brontes. I'm going to be mentioning it in my forthcoming as an intention that I formed right at the beginning of the project.
It was actually purely accidental on my part. I was reading a Guardian article about something having to do with the Bronte sisters, and and how the spelling of Haworth jumped out at me, and I had to run to my copy of your book to see if it was spelled exactly, if it's off by one vowel. So
right.
Anyway, it was very exciting. So there are some extended forays here into philosophical reflection, such as Goethe and Thoreau. What influenced you in regard to your emotional resonance vis-a-vis those philosophers and those little jaunts that you take?
Well, I think that there's nothing wrong with having ideas in a novel, and in fact, it'd be rather harrowing if there were no ideas at all. But the question is how far they're integrated with the lives of the characters. So although there are philosophical and scientific excursions in this book, they're always related to what's going on in the private lives of the characters involved. And I suppose, so I came to those passages by imagining the characters. When Francis, who's the ecologist, is walking around Haworth, the Bronte land, as we now know it is, thinking about resting in awareness and various things which are fairly flagrantly Buddhist in origin. That's just what I imagined he would be doing as he was walking around. He's trying to rest in awareness. In a way, he's trying to find something that is more fundamental, that underlies all these tormenting dualities. And just as an exercise, while he's checking the refugia to see whether any of the rare animals they're hoping will return have returned. So it really came through imagining the inner lives of my characters rather than wanting to make points. But it's funny you should mention Goethe and who because he wasn't really on my mind when I wrote this book. But I suppose Elective Affinities is a book in which science and love try to join hands, chemistry and love. And also at that time, at the time when Humboldt was around, there were polymaths, there were people who didn't believe in the divide between the humanities and the sciences. And I suppose I feel some nostalgia for that period. There's that book, The Invention of Nature by Andrea Wolff, which you may have read, which is about Alexander von Humboldt's life. And, you know, poets and philosophers and chemists and geologists were all sharing ideas. They didn't think that, they weren't lost in little specialities. You know, they thought that a fiction writer and a field researcher might have something to tell each other that was important about the same subject.
Well, um, I'm just thinking about something you said a moment ago, and of course I can't remember what exactly that was, but it reminded me of Francis, I guess, our botanist, our environmentalist, walking through Haworth, and he's just every time I picture him, he's got mushrooms, and he's poking under mushrooms, he's lifting up mushrooms, he's lifting up rocks, seeing all sorts of things. But you love writing about mushrooms. You love writing about hallucinogenic mushrooms. Am I right?
Well, it's the first time I've done it, I think. I did in On the Edge, I think there's a certain amount of, yes, maybe in On the Edge, some mushrooms get taken in the second chapter. You're absolutely right. Yeah. And that was a long time ago.
This is so joyous. I mean, it's so joyful when our characters all have their mushrooms. I mean, I guess, you know, he takes them home and he dries them and he has them, he gives them to the owners of the property and all, as sort of a housewarming present when he goes over there. So now you're clean. You had been, if I can bring this up, you're clean. You don't, are right? I mean, can I ask that?
I don't inject heroin and
okay.
and cocaine every day like a character in Bad News. No, but I'm not. You know, I drink a glass of wine and I feel like it.
Does being clean and off hallucinogens, I guess, and opiates, has that affected your writing at all, your stories, your literary opus?
Well, all of my books have been written, you know, I'm in a sober state when I'm writing my prose. That's definitely the case. But it's true that I write about mushrooms in double blind, and with great affection, because I think psychedelics. I put psychedelics in a slightly different category from other drugs, you know, because I do think if they are the only drugs which may have some revelatory or transformative power. And so they're in the book as well as a kind of one route out of dualism, out of the subject-object split, because someone who's taking mushrooms flows into the thing that they're looking at, and that flows into them, and so the division of the world into I and it is thrown into question in a really radical and interesting way. And so I guess that's why they're in double blind, rather than just because, you know, they're so great.
And I believe that you address the antidepressive effects of some hallucinogens too, in terms of one of your characters.
Yes, so
Yeah.
I mention them in passing because there is a lot of research around that. I think at Johns Hopkins, certainly at Imperial College in London, there's a man called Professor Nutt, who's done a lot of experiments with psilocybin and found that they have a very salutary effect on depression, much better than SSRIs, because probably because people have this immersive experience and a kind of revelation that's capable of changing their lives. And I think there have been other medical experiments with MDMA connected with trauma, which have been very successful, and I think are about to get FDA approval. So there's a side. There's a side of psychedelics and also MDMA, which isn't strictly a psychedelic, but which is becoming medical, and I think will be a lot of help to a lot of people.
On one or more pages, in more than one instance, characters remark on the brain and the mind in the same sentence. And I'm wondering, how do you differentiate between the brain and the mind?
Well, the mind-body problem is a very old problem, and I guess the question is whether we differentiate between them at all. If you're a physicalist, you don't. You think that that electrochemical activity in the brain is all you need to explain consciousness. But then it has to be an epiphenomenon, like steam emerging from boiling water, something that emerges from electrochemical activity. And yet we don't, that's not how it feels. And this is the problem of qualia, it's that we don't, there's this display of consciousness that we're all having, all these colors, all these emotions, and all these memories, and their complexity and richness and subjectivity don't seem to be reducible to electrochemical activity. And that doesn't mean that it's not taking place, but it's not what we're consciously experiencing. At some level, you could say we're experiencing it because it is happening in our own bodies. But usually experience means something that you're aware of having. And we're not aware of all this electrochemical activity. So why do we have this extraordinary display of experience? And so, well, there's a lot of debate about this. I don't want to get very technical about it because it's consciousness studies is a rich and complex field that's making very little progress. Since I went to Tucson in 1996, I occasionally dip into the Journal of Consciousness Studies to reassure myself that I haven't missed a breakthrough.
So speaking of that, throughout your novels, including moments in Patrick Melrose, you talk about consciousness, which has clearly been an interest of yours for decades and decades, which is essentially what it feels like to be alive, you say. How can neuroscience encompass this discipline? Is that through brain mapping too? What is, explain that, please.
Well, neuroscience is a very useful tool, I think, for dealing with physical illness. It tells us something about the brain, but how much it tells us about the mind and the personality, and is another question. And I suppose the problem is that the neuroscience really measures the images you get from an fMRI are measuring, the blood flow within your brain, and certain areas light up, and then the assumption is that there's a correlation between those areas and whatever experience you're having at the time. And there are lots of problems with that correlation, which I go into in the novel. But neuroscience is just is accumulating evidence on one side of the explanatory gap, the third person perspective, the so-called objective side of reality. And yet, whether it's telling us anything important about the nature of what we're feeling and going through is something that's open to question. And that's something that I drill down on from many different directions in the novel.
Yeah. And we discussed this briefly before, you and I, but I love this quote. Science is a guy in Big Sur, a landowner in Big Sur, a wealthy Republican, says, science is mostly common sense with a lot of uncommon words snapping at its heels. And so my question is, I wanted to know if this was your way of assuring me, a reader of novels, and a lot of detective fiction, that we needn't be afraid of science, that it's not a foreign language and we shouldn't run away from it.
I think yes, that's said by Jim Burrows, who's a minor character and in the novel, and he's saying that to our friend Francis, the ecologist, because he's about to receive a proposal about rewilding his own land, and he wants it not to be, too technical and confusing and full of uncommon words. And Francis promises that he will do that. But that certainly isn't my, I'm in no position. I'm an amateur, member, an interested member of the public who's writing about science. I certainly don't think that it's, true of all science. I think a lot of science is incredibly counterintuitive and difficult to understand. And Schrodinger's cat, which I always thought was, until I wrote this novel and researched it, I always thought was an illustration of what quantum theory really meant. Whereas Schrodinger was trying to say, if this is what quantum theory means, it's obviously absurd, since the cat can't be both dead and alive and waiting for someone to open the box and with the observer effect cause one of those two possibilities to collapse into an actuality. So he was using it as an illustration of the absurdity and of some of the conclusions of quantum theory. I think all of that is very difficult, but in the novel, I've done my best to fill it years of research and make it as simple as possible, and I'm not a scientist, so I wanted it to be accessible to an ordinary interested reader like myself, someone who is a novelist and not trained as a scientist, and yet who thinks it's a very interesting field, and that I don't want the humanities and the sciences to be segregated, and that I do want to see whether they have something to tell each other and to inform each other about in looking at health and suffering and ecology and neuroscience and genetics and all these other subjects that I touch on in the novel, and psychotherapy.
Right. And to our audience, if you have any questions, please email them to reservations@writersblockpresents.com. I'll get to them in a few minutes. We have some great ones. So people are interested in you as an individual, as the author of the Patrick Melrose novels. I know you want to get away from that, but a lot of the same material exists in Double Blind that exists in, in your previous work. There are themes, there are threads. In Double Blind, there's a discussion about the possibility that mental illness and trauma can be genetically transferred, as you mentioned earlier, from one generation to the next. One of the characters, Olivia, is pregnant, so that issue sits with us as readers. We're concerned. New studies, I just read an article in the Atlantic. I mean, it was from several years ago, and the Guardian was from several years ago, but I dug them up, suggest that traumatic experiences of previous generations can shape the lives of subsequent generations. It's been shown in Holocaust studies that Holocaust survivors can pass on their distress and their fear to subsequent generations. Can you talk about that relevance to you personally?
Well, that's an epigenetic phenomenon rather than a genetic phenomenon. I don't think anyone is claiming that that people's genome was altered by trauma and that then they were able to pass it on, that it's heritable. What's surprising is that there are these influences that defy the genetic model. And there's a paper that's mentioned in Double Blind about these mice who were electrocuted when they were exposed to a certain smell in a classic sort of Pavlovian study, and then they were completely separated. The next generation were artificially inseminated, and even the grandchildren of those traumatized mice were experiencing fear in the presence of that smell, and that fear couldn't have possibly gone into the genes and been transferred through the sperm in the classic fashion. So there is such a thing as epigenetic trauma, and you're right, certainly with Holocaust victims of the grandchildren of people who were in concentration camps, experiencing a great sense of trauma without having known their grandparents, but it somehow passed through the psyche of the parents into the next generation. So those phenomena are real and they're psychological. And in the novel, I go into the genetics of schizophrenia because there is a schizophrenic character in the novel. And genetics are very unimpressive at explaining human traits and complex mental illnesses. And in my own case, yes, you're asking me, I don't about trauma and generations. I don't know. Really that I can comment on that. I think the children of people who've been severely traumatized and who know that their parent one of their parents has been severely traumatized are bound to be influenced by that. And it's a subtle and complex story at how that influence affects them. I'm sorry, my phone's ringing. It'll stop. It's a landline. Imagine that. So
Right.
I can switch it to silent. Yes.
Okay. I thank you. I'm going to move to, before we go to audience questions, I just have a few more. Our botanist, Francis, is a really fun, interesting character. And he is singularly dedicated to preserving the world. He gives us direction. He tells us what's at stake in terms of climate crisis. And he proposes, for example, that we can all change the world for the better, one individual at a time. He says we can stick a bird feeder on our balcony. We can stick a bird feeder on a tree. We can we can plant a bush. We can, there are so many things that individuals can do to help our planet, one single person at a time. Are you hopeful that we can deal with this crisis? Are you hopeful about that?
Yes, I think it's one of the possible silver linings of this pandemic, that everyone seems to have become more concerned about saving the planet than they were before. So I am hopeful, and there's a connection between climate change and pandemics, because both of them are connected with the friction between the human world and the wild world. And pandemics are going to come from what they call zoonotic diseases, but diseases which come from another species and break into our species, and for which our immune systems are not prepared. And there are many viruses out there waiting to be transferred to the human world. And the easiest way to ensure that they are is to go on destroying the wilderness, and then we can ensure that that takes place. So one way or another, I think that has helped concentrate our minds, and whatever our motivation, I think a lot of people are more alert to this, and I am hopeful.
Good.
I'm not really. Although we may well be the authors of the sixth extinction during the age that's named after us, the Anthropocene age. But I am more hopeful than I have been. I think we've dwelt a lot on the problem, and in Double Blind, I place things within the solution, within the rewilding project, within the analytic session, within whatever context the injury is in. I place it within the solution, because I think the problem is already well enough established. I don't think. I mean, some people apparently need to be persuaded that there's a crisis, but I think most people don't any longer.
This is off track, but of interest. Your books are peopled with affluent, highly educated characters. In this book, they're not aristocrats, but they're intellectuals. Do their lofty educations substitute for aristocracy in this book?
I know, they're just something completely different.
Okay.
A lot of upper class people have no education at all.
Yeah, that's so, and on that thread, I suppose crazy rich Brits have caused trouble in your novels from the very beginning. They're the most threatening, as we saw in Patrick Melrose, and there's one in particular in Double Blind. Where does that come from? Is it just the world or
where does what come from? Sorry, crazy rich Brits.
Causing trouble. you
No,
know?
there aren't any crazy rich Brits in Double Blind, I don't think. There's
Well, Hunter, I mean, he was born,
he's American, but he was educated
yeah.
in yes, his parents moved to London for part of his life, probably to make my job easier, in describing his schooling at Westminster, which by a strange coincidence I also went to. But
Did you hang over the ledge just like Hunter did at Westminster, smoking a joint, hang over, upside down from some rooftop parapet or
I'm
something?
afraid I did transfer some of my memories directly to Hunter, and so I don't think in this case Hunter's the only person who's rich in this novel, and because he's a venture capitalist, and I needed another way into science, which was rooted in ordinary human concerns, like health or sanity or business, and so I had a venture capitalist, and he needed to have a little bit of money. I mean, maybe he could have had a startup and not had any money, but I decided that he was quite far down the line and had a few successes already.
You give him some really good humanity, like he's not as funny as Father Guido, for example. One of my, he's the star, Father Guido. And did we talk about Father Guido? I know you and I did earlier, but I can't remember if it was in.
No, we haven't talked about him. You mentioned him when we were chatting for a few minutes before we started this interview. Yes, Father Guido just turned up. He's one of those things that that sometimes happens to a novelist. He was just a minor character who was supervising the brain scan of a mystic in the woods near Assisi, and he was just the abbot in charge of the Franciscan monastery where this mystic lived, and then somehow he took over one of the long mosaic chapters, as I call them, where you drop in and out of different minds. They're not made up of a single point of view, because I think that's the only way to do parties at all realistically. And
There are a
I
lot of
just
parties.
started thinking what Father Guido might be thinking, and somehow he kind of took over chapter 14, and I think he's probably the most sort of adorable and innocent character that I've ever created, and
And
I
for
really like him.
he's
But he's
divine.
not based on anyone. I've never met anyone like Father Guido. He just sort of unfolded.
He loves the big parties, the fancy parties that he's invited to. He's a rural priest, and he is completely seduced by the trappings of um opulence that
Well, it's actually the first big party he's ever been to, and he feels very guilty about it becoming his favorite party because
right. And the only other party that he had been to was Father so and so's birthday party in the vegetable
yes,
garden.
brother Manfredi's
Right.
party in the vegetable birthday party in the vegetable garden, which had been the talk of the monastery for many weeks afterwards, and that's his background as a party goer until he turns up at Cap Party, but at the venture capitalist party.
So you always have fun with religion, with New Age, with gurus. I mean, it is just that those are targets for you. And yet you take Father Guido and you handle him so gently and so beautifully and lovingly. That was a choice from the very beginning, right? I mean,
That's who he is. He is very lovable, and he's and innocent, and he has he's in a state of revelation at this party, and comes to a kind of panpsychist position where he thinks everything is conscious and everything is sacred, and
including, I'm interrupting you, including,
sorry.
Including the remote control switch for the blinds. I mean, that's
Yes,
a divine
that's
revelation.
later on, exactly. Yes, that happens as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, so I'm gonna ask. I know that that you're tired, so I'm gonna jump. Well, you don't seem tired at all, but I'm assuming because so.
You've woken me up.
Okay, good. I'm glad I've woken you up. And we have a few great questions. Elaborate on the differences between gurus in California and the kind of guru in Europe to whom your mother left your family's French estate. Such a tragedy. That just kills me still.
I don't know if I can pinpoint any particular difference. Guru just means teacher, and teachers could be wonderful and be authentic. I guess when they're charlatans, it doesn't matter whether they live in Europe or in California. I think the receptors for gurus are people who are very credulous, and I guess Eleanor Melrose has that credulity which makes the guru possible, and she I can't remember how she's described at last, but she's sort of she rushes. It's something like rushing, rushing to the incredible, like an ambulance to an emergency. The more unbelievable something is, the more she feels it's in need of being believed. As if it was a starving child. So,
do you, thinking about your the susceptibility to these gurus and healers or whatever, are women more susceptible to that?
I haven't run a double-blind study on,
okay.
on susceptibility to gurus. I wish I had the evidence to hand, but, I think it's just a human propensity to want to believe things that are encouraging or that are miraculous, which break the apparent laws of determinism. And then there's that susceptibility is potentially a good thing, because it could make you question those laws and probe them and doubt them, and that's a scientific activity. But when you believe something simply because it's incredible, then it seems to me you're drifting into dangerous territory. Or you think it's more believable because it's incredible.
Well, that could be
or
said.
that people must be trying to disguise its truth because there's no evidence for it, and so forth. Then that's where there's a possibility of getting lost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How do you continually come up with the ideas for these wonderfully awful parents? And how do you go about creating them and making them so nuanced and fascinating? One loves to hate them, and yet they're always fully human.
Well, well, thank you, whoever said that. But I mean, there aren't Double Blind doesn't have any awful parents in it, although or only very peripherally. I don't think Lost for Words has any awful parents in it, as far as I remember. I mean, I quite often don't write about awful parents. The main case is the Melroses, and that's quite simply based on my own life. So it wasn't a very difficult search. And yeah, are there any other awful parents?
Yes, Sebastian's and Olivia's.
Yes, those are the what I describe as peripheral. Yeah, the Tanners who adopt Sebastian, but their awfulness is quite different. Their awfulness is to do with being so emotionally stunted, you know, and unempathic. They're not deliberately cruel or disastrously inadvertent like the Melroses, you know, like David and Eleanor.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to end, because, you know, deliciously awful parents are, you know, they gave you something, Teddy.
They did. I have so much to thank them for. Yeah.
Yeah. Wait, one more question, because this is Los Angeles. Do you see, you know, what did you think of the Showtime series, you know, the Benedict Cumberbatch series, and you know, what's next for, you know, for Double Blind?
My goodness, look at those post-its.
Yeah.
Andrea, you're so hardworking. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, I loved the series, and I thought Benedict was absolutely brilliant, who incidentally is the reader of Double Blind for the audiobook. So because we've become friends, and he loved Double Blind and insisted on reading it, which was really, really generous of him. And so I loved the series. I thought Edward Berger did a brilliant direction, and I mean the future for Double Blind is that it has been optioned, which is very exciting for a television series, and we're at an early stage with that, and but I'm thrilled that it's been optioned, and
Well,
hope it works out.
I hope it works out. Congratulations, everybody. Forget my post-its, but go to our website and go to Skylight Books, and you'll find Double Blind, and it's just, and look for Father Guido opening the blinds, opening and closing the blinds. Thank you so much, Teddy, and I look forward to seeing you in London or in Los Angeles.
Thank you, Andrea. So either will do. I look forward to it as well. Thanks so much. You've been so kind.
Thank you. And this was Teddy's first Zoom interview. So, you know.
Yeah, that explains a lot. Okay, thanks.
And you lived through it, and it was great. And thank you.
Thank you.
And see you soon.
Good night. Bye.
Good night. Bye-bye.